Hey everybody, welcome to Q Plus EDU 2021. We are super excited you are here with us today. Today's session is a great one for parents, guardians, caregivers, anybody who's looking after minors, after young folks. I'm super thrilled to welcome one of my favorite coworkers, my colleague Cassidy. Cassidy has provided therapy at Out Youth since 2015 and in private practice at Hill Country Therapy since 2016. And they specialize in care for queer and trans youth, adults, and families. Cassidy has experience working with individuals, group therapy, offering training to other professionals, and they're super passionate about empowering disempowered folks and erased narratives in and outside of the therapy space. So we are super grateful that Cassidy is taking their time to share their brilliance with us today. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Cass. I will be off camera in the chat if folks join us in the chat and have questions. And I'm also here for technical support. So if anything comes up, do let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Frederick. So we can go ahead and get started. And if folks join us in the chat, please ask any questions you have. It's fine to be a discussion, of course. Other than that, we can kind of go straight through some recommendations. Of course, everybody's experience is not going to be similar. And so everybody's outcome or maybe decisions or route they choose to take from this, if anything, will not be similar as well. And that's okay. So let me go ahead and pull up my presentation here. Let's see if I can share my screen. Hang on just a second. Okay, if I can present. There we go. Okay. Can we see this? Is this okay? I didn't do full screen earlier.
It looks fantastic.
Okay, great. So yeah, searching for your child's potential therapist is a big thing. You know, you are seeking care for your young person who can't consent to their own care legally, which is something to navigate. So let's talk about this a little bit more in depth. I'm going to go over some topics for us. So some things to be thinking about, and what I'm going to be going over are parameters. So parameters would be things like your specifications for a therapist, your child's specifications for a therapist, licensure. There are so many license types. What are they? What do they mean? I'm going to go over consent and assent, and where to find this information and where to search, and then WPATH, which is the World Public Health Administration of Transgender Health. So let's keep going. For any folks that are here, I want to type in the chat. I think, let's see. Yeah, I don't think we have folks live with us right now, but I want to encourage you to think about this before we kind of get into our topics here. So what's been your biggest struggle in finding therapy support for your young person? I want to encourage you to keep that in mind as we go through this. And then what is your biggest concern in finding therapy support for your young person? So those things are a bit different. So go ahead and write those things down. You can pause here if you like, if you need a second, but I'm going to keep going. So let's talk about parameters. So these are specifications, right? So things you want to consider: therapist identities or lived experience. Maybe your young person would like to see a therapist who has a similar lived experience, a similar identity. Maybe they don't. It's important to keep that in mind as you search. Nowadays, this is very recent actually, where certain sites for therapist profiles like Psychology Today, which is something we're going to talk about later, have ways you can search for identities represented by that therapist, and not just identities that that therapist works with, which is a huge gain in searching. So think about that. What kind of identities do you want to see in the therapist? What kind of identities or lived experience would your kiddo want to see? And if you don't know, ask them. Another parameter that's really important is cost. Therapy can be very cost prohibitive. So have a ballpark idea. You know, what can I spend a month? What is reasonable? Some things to look for are sliding scale, which are prices that therapists can offer, for folks who maybe meet income requirements or have a lower income or would struggle to pay for therapy. Sliding scale is usually a short list of spaces that a therapist can offer. So some therapists may say things like, the sliding scale is full, or I have a wait list for my sliding scale. And if you hear the word wait list, it's okay to go ahead and get on it while you are searching for other options. So that's sliding scale. Insurance, if you're going to be using insurance, make sure that that therapist takes your insurance. And then of course, private pay is whatever the cost that would be listed is. So know this ahead of time. Location, we're in a bit of a pandemic lately. So telehealth is really, really prevalent, which is great. Prior to this, I will say, kind of on the therapist end of things, getting certified to do telehealth and finding software to do telehealth with was fairly difficult. So now, with our majority of practices being in telehealth or needing to be virtual, that has expanded quite a lot. So almost all therapists can pretty much offer telehealth, and most insurance will cover it, if not all insurance right now. So that's really good. But thinking about that, is telehealth an option that you want? Is telehealth the best option for your kiddo? What about in person? Maybe a combination of both. Something to know, something to ask ahead of time. And of course, deal breakers. So a deal breaker would be any reason that you absolutely would not continue seeing a therapist, or not continue allowing your child to see a therapist, or not seek that person out. And so those deal breakers may be something separate. They may be deal breakers within each of these categories, or categories that you have that I didn't list. But know those hard boundaries and keep them. It's perfectly okay to have hard boundaries that will limit your search exponentially if you do so. Okay, so again, if you need to pause here, maybe you want to answer some of these questions, think about these things for yourself and for your kiddo, identifying some of these parameters before we start our search or before we keep moving on. So let's talk about licensure types. You will see a lot of different abbreviations after therapist names. And I do want to tell you, any of these abbreviations can practice therapy in the state of Texas. And statistically, if you look at the research, not licensure type, not technique, not type of therapy is as closely related to, I guess, healing repairs is closely related to success in therapy as the relationship between the therapist and the client. So this is a bit less important overall, but still important for you to know. I think it can feel overwhelming trying to identify, which license type is better. And the important thing is the relationship. But let's just go through some of this. So the first one I have here is LMFT, LMFT Associate, and LMFT-S. So anyone with an MFT abbreviation after their name is certified to be a marriage and family therapist. Does that mean they can only work with folks who are coupled or partnered, or folks who are in family dynamics? No. They can work with individuals, they can work with couples, they can work with multiple partner structures and family groups. So all this indicates is a little bit different training. MFT folks, marriage and family therapists, go through a little bit extra training to look at systems, and they learn a little bit more around systemic modalities. But they certainly can practice therapy. And so an LMFT is someone who is fully licensed in the state of Texas. An LMFT associate is someone who is licensed to provide therapy, but is still under supervision. Most of these folks are somewhere in their process of gaining hours to be an LMFT. And because they're under supervision, it's kind of like having two therapists in the room, which is like a very good deal. So LMFT associate and LMFT-S. That just means that person's a supervisor. So they are probably supervising an LMFT associate. Again, all three of these designators can provide therapy. All three of these designators indicate someone who has ability to practice. Moving on to the next one is LPC, LPC associate, and LPC-S. So LPC just stands for licensed professional counselor. Licensed professional counselors can work with individuals, can work with couples, partner structures, families, family groups, anything like that. So both of these licenses so far can practice with any kind of amalgamation of folks in the room. So similar to MFT, LPC is someone who is licensed, fully licensed, doesn't have a supervisor. An LPC associate, or formerly LPC intern, is someone who is licensed to practice but has a supervisor. Again, 2 people in the room. We love it. Extra care, extra brains can only support us more. So LPCS, same thing as LMFTS, is a supervisor. They're probably supervising an associate. So next up, we have our social worker designations. So that's going to be LCSW, LMSW, BSW, MSW, and DSW. That's a lot. The SW, you can guess, means social worker. LCSW is a licensed clinical social worker. So similar to LMFT and LPC, they're just not under supervision. They're licensed to provide therapy in the state of Texas. An LMSW is a licensed master social worker, which means they do have a supervisor. They can provide therapy, and again, 2 brains in a room. A BSW, an MSW, and a DSW alone, typically you won't see those people practicing under those designations. You're not able to practice therapy just yet, but you may see BSW, MSW, or DSW before the clinical designation. So BSW just means a baccalaureate or bachelor's of social work. MSW means master's in social work, and DSW is doctorate in social work. BSW, MSW, DSW, again, fairly rare. You won't see those things on their own, but LMSW, LCSW can practice in the state of Texas, and you may see next to some of these other designators. And then finally, we have PsyD, which is a doctorate of psychology. So this person's a psychologist, can practice in the state of Texas. Typically, again, training a little bit different, goes through different kind of focus in schools. So the differences are within application, not necessarily in building that relationship. So again, I want to encourage folks not to be overwhelmed by this stuff. None of these folks can be ranked really in who's better, what's better. They're all about equal and how we can practice. Again, focusing on the relationship is where I want to encourage you to, encourage you to keep tabs on as you try to develop a relationship with this person or your kiddo is. So let's keep going. So let's talk about informed consent and assent. So therapists, of course, when we first start working with someone, we offer something called informed consent, which means we're going to inform you on the care that we're going to give you, and you have to consent to it. The problem with consent is that only folks over 18 who have the legal right to consent for services can sign the consent. So for folks under 18, for the most part, need a caregiver, a primary guardian, someone who has the legal right to consent for that young person. If you are an extended family member, for example, maybe if you are just watching this young person, living with them for the summer, but the person who can consent to their care is elsewhere, we need to make sure we're in contact with that person. Additionally, sometimes in divorce decrees or other kinds of split custody agreements, there are designations of who can give consent. Make sure you know what yours says if you have one. And if you need to provide a copy of that, at least that page, to the therapist so that you can sign the consent, I want to encourage you to just be ready to do that. Sometimes therapists ask for it. If they don't, you may see language like, by signing here, you are indicating that you can legally consent for this person. Both are fine, but if you're not sure if you can legally consent, I want to encourage you to confirm that beforehand. Sometimes in emancipation cases, folks who are 17 can consent to their own care, but that's kind of a tricky situation. So if that's something that's going on for you, I want to encourage you to seek some guidance around it. Or if you know of a young person who is emancipated and seeking care, to explore some resources and what that looks like. So that's what consent is. So you may now be wondering, how can a young person give consent? And the real answer is that legally they can't. They can offer assent. And what assent is the agreement of someone who is not able to give legal consent to that activity. So they're agreeing to go to therapy. If your young person does not give assent for therapy, I really want to encourage you to listen to them and explore other options for support. Or if therapy is probably the best route for one reason or another, and they do not give assent, I want to encourage you to let the therapist know, so that can be something we explore in the room with your young person. It's really hard to build trust without folks assenting to their care. So these are two things to know. Let's see. Let's keep going. So with consent and assent, we brought up confidentiality and privacy. Confidentiality is really important in the therapy room. Privacy is really important in the therapy room. That's how we build trust and keep folks safe. So confidentiality, a brief summary is what's said in here stays in here. There are a few exceptions to that, which I will just summarize as someone being under 18, which we already indicated, and exceptions of harm. So someone who's under 18, unfortunately, really does not have the right to confidentiality. And again, how can you build trust with someone when they don't actually get that confidential space? So I personally try to orient towards empowerment through privacy, which I will say most therapists who work with young folks do this. So you have to build trust by honoring privacy, which is keeping folks under 18 very, very involved or in charge of logistics around breaking confidentiality. This could be an instance of maybe there's an exception of harm. And so keeping that young person involved in that entire process. Another instance would be if a parent asks a therapist for some details directly, typically to empower that young person to assent to their care. The way I would go about it and see other therapists go about it is say, give me a moment. I'm going to run this through my client, who is your young person, and make sure we're all on the same page on what I'm about to share. Again, so keeping them in the driver's seat so that they can build that trust in the therapy room, and so that we can empower them to consent to their care when they're over 18 and assent to their care prior to that. So these are some things you want to keep in mind as you look for a therapist. You want someone who's going to empower your kiddo to take care of themselves and help them have boundaries while being safe. Let's see. So now we know confidentiality, consent, assent. We got our parameters down. Now we got to go where the therapists are. So there's a lot of search engines to find therapists. The most common one is Psychology Today. There are other ones that are a little bit more specific. There's a website called Inclusive Therapists, which works almost exactly like Psychology Today, but it's for folks who see LGBTQ, queer and trans folks. So that's another one to check. There are many resource guides available online, including ours. And I'm going to go through examples of all of these here in a second. Something else to keep in mind as you're looking at profiles, everyone has their little blurb up, and there may be a lot of therapy words in there, words that you're not familiar with or don't connect with, and that's perfectly okay. But it is an indicator that maybe there are words that you would connect with more, or that your young person would connect with more. So again, narratives are important in this process, maybe adding to your parameters, even identifying some keywords for your young person that you can look for in therapist profiles, things that feel important. These could be indicators of words like LGBTQ+, queer, trans, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, NB, asexual, gray sexual, anything like that that feels specific and feels important. I want to encourage you to keep that in mind as you read through therapist narratives. Just as important as maybe modality or theory, just as important as that relationship, these can be good indicators that someone might be able to relate well to your young person. So let's take a look at some of these three. So we're going to look at Psychology Today first, and let's see if I can get out a full screen here. Okay. Whoops. Bear with me just a second, y'all. There we go. Okay. Here we go. So this is Psychology Today, very general for therapists in Austin, Texas. Psychology Today is really helpful because you can search by all your parameters that you already wrote down, which is great. So we can use any kind of filter we want here. We have issues, maybe what's going on with your young person, insurance, gender, types of therapy, age, price, other kinds of things. And what's really, really important and was a recent update is ethnicity. So probably up until about last year, I believe, if you are searching for a therapist of color, for a Black therapist, for an Indigenous therapist, if you were searching for those identity words specifically, that wouldn't really come up. What would come up is folks who work with those identities. And that's not quite what folks are searching for. Luckily, they've updated this recently, and it's been really helpful, I believe, because if we just look at the statistics, I suppose, or the social layout of therapists in Austin, it's folks are fairly white, and that reflects the population in Austin. And there's nothing wrong with having a white therapist, but it may not be someone who represents an identity that may be important to be represented in the therapist for your young person. And it's okay to look for that. And I really encourage you to do so. So now if we do things like ethnicity served, so if I click on Black or African American, it's going to show me mostly Black and African American therapists who have indicated that in their profile, which is really, really helpful. Same thing, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and Latino. Again, we still have a few limitations here in how we search, but it is a lot better. So again, cue in on those identities. Think about what's important to be represented in a therapist for your young person. Let's look at inclusive therapists. So very similar to Psychology Today. Just a search engine for folks who list their profiles. And you could see the values of this. This, again, is a newer group, or a newer site, I should say, for searching for therapists. You can explore kind of their activism, folks that are listed here, how to get matched with folks. Very similar to Psychology Today, just another option. And the last thing I mentioned, of course, was resource guides. So I'm going to show you ours. There are a lot of resource guides online, and if you don't know where to look, it's okay to type therapist resource guide and just see what comes up. So if you go to our website and navigate to our resource guides page, we have several kind of identifying, I guess, umbrellas of resources that we've packed together. Most of these are multiple pages long. So it's okay to take some time to go through them. And this, again, is just a way to kind of narrow your search in the beginning to help you focus, because there are a lot of options. There are a lot of good options. So let's come back to our presentation over here. So that's where to look. Also, word of mouth, not listed, but understood. Word of mouth is a great place. Talking to people who are in similar situations as you, asking where they sought care, maybe where they didn't seek care. Again, those deal breakers, who's not going to work, what's not going to work, things like that. So again, pause here if you need to, identify some keywords, add it to your list of parameters, and think about what online spaces you want to go search for, or what spaces you want to ask, maybe people you want to ask, people who you trust, things like that. The last thing, one of our topics here, and this is kind of a parameter, kind of not, but WPATH, again, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And this is straight from their website. WPATH publishes the standards of care and ethical guidelines for providers of gender care, essentially, for folks who work with trans folks. So seeing this acronym, WPATH, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good therapist. Like any indicator, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good therapist, a good fit for your kiddo, but it is an indicator, again, that maybe we're getting closer. So WPATH, something to look for as one of those key words. And if you're curious about the standards of care that you want to see in a provider, this is a great place to go look for them. They publish the standards of care. So this again is another keyword to keep an eye on. And those get updated every few years. And this is a great question for, potential therapists, especially for folks exploring gender care. If your kiddo is gender creative or gender questioning, trans identified, trans umbrella identified, anything else like that. It's okay to ask, do you follow the WPATH guidelines? Do you follow the standards of care? And speaking a bit more about that. Well, if folks have other questions, I don't think we have any folks here in the chat, but if you've come up with other questions just during this webinar, if you feel like you have some things unanswered, you have a whole host of new questions, you're more than welcome to contact me. I believe my contact information is listed in the event, but if not, it's Cassidy@outyouth.org or Cassidy.Laminack@outyouth.org. Both will get to me. So if you think of questions, I'm happy to help. Let me thank you for your participation. You're wonderful. We're so glad you're here, and I hope this has been helpful and worth your time.
Cass, I have learned so much. I don't know how you packed so much information into half an hour. I was like, oh, like even just, you've heard me complain over and over again about all the letters of like after all the therapists. I'm like, who are people and what do these letters mean?
Right.
So even just that slide was so okay.
Very confusing, very confusing.
So one of the things that you said early on kind of like piqued my ears is, you're talking about the fact that minors can't consent, but that's not necessarily true everywhere. Is that a Texas specific thing? And I know most of the things you're talking about are Texas specific, but I feel like I've heard that like in other states, like minors can consent to like healthcare and like mental health care and medical health care too.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is for the state of Texas. And there are those cases of emancipation, and those are really specific. Outside of Texas, I'm not sure. The legal age of consent varies a little bit. And then there are different types of consent. So consenting to care is specifically kind of what we're talking about. And there are some exceptions within the state of Texas. I believe the only exceptions are going to be those exceptions of emancipation. And again, they're really, really specific.
And that's like marriage, so like if a minor is married to someone, right, is one of the exceptions. And then if
that I'm not sure of, actually. I'm not sure of the marriage exception.
It's kind of weird and gross, but not to be judgy, but we don't want 15-year-olds married anywhere. But if they are married, they might have, I feel like that was one of the things that I had seen in for folks to be able to access healthcare like birth control. If they're married, because their parents had to have signed that they could get married and all those things, that then it kind of transferred that like ability to consent to care to the minor themselves.
Yeah, yes.
Wrong, so don't definitely do some Googling if this is your case.
The marriage one, I'm not quite sure on that. I know there are exceptions of emergency when it comes to some medical care. And most providers like Planned Parenthood, like SAFE, for example, doctors are well aware of that, but that doesn't apply to therapy. That would apply to things like birth control, things like that.
Would that apply to things like a psychiatric emergency? So if a minor were to show up at like Austin State Hospital, I don't even know if they actually do emergency psych care, but if a minor were to show up somewhere where they do the psychiatric holds for people, would they need to get parental consent, or could they say like, I'm in a bad way, I need someone to make sure I don't hurt myself?
Right. Yes, that would be a case of emergency, in which case they can kind of move forward with triage, but then they would have to find the caregiver, the person to consent for that young person.
Okay.
So, they wouldn't necessarily present at like Austin State Hospital. They could, but they would probably get rerouted to PES, which is Psychiatric Emergency Services. And there are several kind of locations of that around town. But if anyone's having a psychiatric emergency or a mental health emergency, you can go to any emergency room, medical emergency room, and walk in, say, this is what's going on for me. And they can get you routed to care.
Awesome. Thank you. I had another question that came up, but it totally flew away while we were talking about minors and consent. Yeah, I don't remember.
I hope it comes to you.
I know, I'm sure
like
minutes after we get off this webinar, I'll be like, oh yeah, that was what I wanted to ask.
You just get me on Slack. We'll see if we can answer it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, it's going to bug me, but it's okay.
I hope it comes to you.
But thank you so much. This has been super helpful. I think it will be really useful for folks, when trying to sort out, what care looks like for minors in Texas. How would the proposed legislation that our wonderful elected officials are discussing, how would that impact you and your job and what it looks like for gender expansive minors in Texas to get care?
Yeah, I did not look at the most recent list for the most recent special session they got called. Can you remind me what they're bringing back on the docket?
I can never remember. I can't keep the numbers straight, but I'm fairly sure that one of them is that it's basically just that minors can't access gender affirming care of any kind.
They're bringing that one back. Okay.
I know. I know.
I thought it was just the sports ban. Let me look. Let me read the verbiage because there were several iterations of that particular one. And they all do something a little bit different and a little bit uniquely insidious. So
I feel like I remember reading a quote from a parent saying that, like, if the bill were to pass, that they felt like they wouldn't have any option but to move out of state because it would mean that they could be criminalized for providing like care for their child.
Right. That was the iteration that had the most teeth. And that one was in the first session, just the regular session, legislative session. And it didn't come back the second time, but the sports ban came back. Didn't make it through, didn't get spoken about, but I'm not sure right now. Let me take a look real quick. I know Quality Texas sends out pretty good updates about that.
Yeah, they're definitely my go-to to follow all this stuff. I just can't like all of the numbers and things. I'm like, wait.
Well, while I'm looking for that, I can speak on the one you mentioned. Basically, the teeth in that bill stated that any kind of gender affirming care would be constituted as child abuse. And so that would become a reason to break confidentiality, would become harm, listed as harm. So, it'd be a call to CBS or an investigation. And it's bonkers. I don't know what else to say about that one. That is extremely harmful, essentially barring access. And then making parents, potentially criminalized for trying to get affirming healthcare for their young person. Blows my mind.
Yeah.
But let me see.
So if it were, I guess the way the laws are written, because it's Texas specific, are there places that folks can find mental health care online where the practitioners are outside of Texas?
Yeah, so
to the same laws.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the most part, counseling licensure is bound to the state that they are in. And that is the state that the client is in. So For example, if you live in the state of Colorado, you wouldn't be able to regularly see a therapist that has licensure to practice in Texas. Some licenses are a little bit more expansive than that, but I believe psychology is one of them. But not exactly sure on that. But social work, marriage and family therapy, professional counseling are all state bound. So they wouldn't be able to see folks outside of the state. Now, vacationing, there are different exceptions for that, of course.
And then are there reputable services for like texting and health, like mental health? I know that there are some text services, but it sounds like those are probably not staffed by licensed counselors, given what you were just saying about the licensure being tied to the state, being tied to the residency.
Yeah. So there are some text-based platforms like that. I think they're a little bit more general. So there's OK to Text, which is just for young folks. There are things like, 7 cups of tea. Trevor Chat, I believe, is one of them. That's for, LGBTQ folks. Not all of these are 24/7. Trans Lifeline is a phone call, but I'm sure they're working on getting a chat line going.
I think they do chat services, yeah.
Okay, great. And just because therapists are bound to only do therapy in the state that they are in does not mean that they can't be the other people on the end of the phone. It just wouldn't be therapy, if that makes sense. So, a lot of us can provide support in that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I found an article from the Texas Tribune from the 4th of August. It was updated on the 6th. It says lawmakers failed to restrict transition-related healthcare options for transgender Texas kids earlier. Governor Abbott wants a state agency to determine if some procedures constitute child abuse. So this is an interesting kind of stomach-churning article, but we will definitely post it with this video.
I think you are right. It doesn't seem like it's on the docket just yet, but Governor Abbott did say he plans to try to bring it back.
Yeah.
And again,
it sounds like it's not only that it would make medical affirming care inaccessible, it would also make mental health inaccessible if it's affirming.
All of it, any kind of gender affirming care from someone with a license would be constituted as child abuse.
That's gnarly. That's so, like you said, just like completely nonsensical.
It's mind-boggling, and it's very violent. So, I hope it doesn't get any kind of traction at all. Because it goes completely against medical standards of care, which are, again, indicated by WPATH and indicated by the medical professionals and mental health professionals that work with folks providing gender care.
Right. And I think that's an important thing for us to reiterate, is that all of the medical consortiums, all of the different boards, all of the groups, so whether it's the American Psychological Association, whether it's the American, what are they called? The pediatrics doctor, like all different groups of doctors and all different kinds of medicine and mental health and physical health, everyone agrees that providing affirming care for youth who are questioning, who are non-binary, who are trans, is the best practice. So I think that's something that, like, as folks who are here to advocate for on behalf of LGBTQ youth, I feel like that's our job to just keep reinforcing that like, this is not, we're not doing surgeries on trans youth. We can absolutely talk to you about surgeries on intersex youth that are not consensual. It's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's really important to remember that, like, all of the professional opinions go this one direction, which is providing care.
Right. Right. There are, evidence-based outcomes. Granted, they're a bit limited because there's not a lot of research on trans folks, but that doesn't mean those outcomes aren't still indicated.
Absolutely. And even things as simple as just using the correct name and pronouns. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Glisten or the Trevor Project, but one of either the Glisten School Climate Survey or a Trevor Project survey, one of the two, found that when trans and non-binary students were called by their chosen name and pronouns, that it reduced their suicidality exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
Something as simple as like using the right name is literally life-saving. And so we're setting the bar super low.
Yeah.
And still tripping over it.
It is low. It is low. Just very unfortunate.
But it's one of the reasons that I'm so grateful to work with you and our amazing clinical staff at Out Youth. And, you talked about if somebody says they've got a wait list, like put your name on the wait list while you're looking for someone else.
Yes.
And, that's one of the unfortunate truths of working at a nonprofit, working at Out Youth, is that our wait list is always long, and we love the community, and we're so glad that everybody wants to see our wonderful counselors. But we know it sucks having to wait.
Yeah.
And so,
thinking about the legislation and the huge surge in folks needing support just around the threat of rights being removed, right? Who maybe otherwise weren't needing therapy at that time. Like, how much space does that take up, right? So there's just so much around legislation that is troublesome.
Absolutely. So in your professional opinion, if someone is having to wait, say, they're in some small town in Texas and they're on a wait list for the only, affirming therapist in their town, what are some things that young folks can do, and that parents and guardians and caregivers who are with those young folks, what are some of the things that they can do to take care of their mental health while they're on that wait list until they can get in with a therapist?
Yeah. So I think finding any kind of affirmation you can do in the meantime, which would be, for some folks it's expression, some folks it's, name and pronoun, some folks it's, other kinds of interaction, changing name at school, as much as you can do to make space for what's happening right now. I think a lot of primary caregivers can get hung up on, well, what if they don't want this in the future? And we can't answer that question, but we can answer it right now, and we can only take care of our present. And there's nothing wrong with doing any of these things. It will only make space for your young person to tell you more about themselves. And if we ask them to make themselves smaller while we're waiting to get therapy support, that is going to be really, really unnecessarily hard. So even if, primary caregivers feel discomfort at that, I think it's really important to take care of your own process too, away from your kiddo, but make space for them as much as you can before, maybe they get to the top of that wait list. And online communities are great. Like you mentioned earlier, there are several for caregivers as well. So just even getting connected there for yourself, and then getting your kiddo connected as well in Discord, in other kinds of online spaces.
Texas GSA Network.
Yes, yes. GSA Network is a great one.
Yeah, and we're always hyping PFLAG. I think there are like 19 different PFLAG groups in Texas.
Yeah, PFLAG is really great. And the PFLAG actually up in New York State has programs for folks who maybe English is not their primary language, or not even one of their spoken languages, of course. So, if you're a young person and maybe your parent speaks a different language, that could be another way to get support for your parent, or for maybe folks in your extended family.
Yeah, and PFLAG Austin has a lot of resources for various communities as well, including links for resources for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in various languages. There's always a lot of Spanish stuff as well. Yeah, we love PFLAG, can't
Mhm.
hype them enough. And
Yeah.
then for young folks, Texas GSA Network is here for students in all schools and homeschooled students.
Mhm.
So we definitely encourage folks to reach out to me and to the Texas GSA Network. My email is easy. It's Frederick with the E in between the R um, and the D. Can I spell my own name? Frederick, the other direction.
We can only do our best.
Frederick at txgsa.org. And then the other thing that I wanted to hype for young folks is Q Chat Space. Q Chat Space is run by Centerlink and YouthLink, it's the organization that connects all of the different LGBTQ orgs across the country with each other. And so that's how staff at places like Out Youth build community with other people doing the similar kind of work across the country. And Q Chat Space is a phenomenal resource. They have chats in Spanish as well. And they're different, like curated chats on different topics at different times and days of the week. So there's almost always something for everybody.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love Q Chat Space. I feel like, like you said, like it's just having community and knowing that you're not alone. And I think for parents too, and like caregivers, that's one of the things that PFLAG does for them, is like let them know that they're not the first parent to have these fears or have these concerns or, go through the what ifs.
Yeah, exactly. And other folks are your biggest resource, I think. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. I super appreciate your wisdom and expertise on this. And we are grateful for you joining us for Q Plus EDU this year, and we'll definitely bring you in next year as well.
Awesome.
And we've got a couple of other great sessions for this week that we would love for you to pop into the audience cast if you feel like.
Of course.
Tomorrow, some of the Youth Advisory Board members from One Love Foundation are going to be leading a conversation called How to Ask Someone Out and Handle the Response You Get. On Friday, we have youth.
Great things to know.
Yeah, absolutely. On Friday, we have youth from across Texas and beyond for a conversation on centering queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in your GSA. And then we have a special Saturday session this week at 1 o'clock on Saturday because of the time difference. It is a panel called Learning from African LGBTQIA+ leaders. And we will have folks joining us from Egypt, Cameroon, Tunisia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. So I'm super excited about that. And we have a whole nother week next week. So EDU just keeps on going. I'm super excited.
Yeah, that sounds really great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Cass. Lovely to see you as always.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
All right, have a good one.
Bye, Frederick.